Many of my men now rest back home, but I sail back across the sea to plan their next steps when they rejoin me. I remember my first voyage across the waters, seeking the city of Nankar, from which the region's magical trinkets originated. After the hostility of the local warlords forced me to turn back, I learned my fate in Korimutren. I would bring Ameioni rule to these lands, replacing their war-torn fields with bountiful farms and setting the stage for those after me to bring prosperity to their people. More interestingly, I learned the exact age of my death, indicating I would survive all else thrown at me. Both of these have proven true thus far, but my work continues. I am in a race against the calendar to establish my city's rule here before my passing, and while I may never lay eyes on Nakyra myself, I must ensure my descendants do. These were the musings of Laskaris, as recorded in his journal. His people named him the Conqueror. They were the Eastern Kheionai, the blue-skinned ruin-born elves who hailed from the only stronghold of civilized thought in the western reaches of Andeos, the island of Alekand. They knew little of their past, but the island's 7 major cities were protected by magical wards from the disaster of the Day of Ashen Skies. Lokemeion, City of Scholars; Kerka, City of Iron and Smoke; Ormam, City of Merchants; Degakeion, City of Soldiers; Oktikeion, City of Ships, Silk and Sugar; Arpedifer, City of Artisans; and Kimanis, the partitioned city. After the catastrophe, the Kheionai gathered the courage to exit their warded settlements to find a completely alien landscape with no civilization to be found. They went about rebuilding what had been lost and then colonizing the empty countryside around them. The Day of Ashen Skies had created a massive and magically contaminated desert to the northeast of Alekand. Its blue-colored sands caused extremely cancerous growths on the body, and they would cause permanent, potentially lethal damage to all those touched directly by it. Periodically, great storms of this sand, called Kaidano, would hit the Kheionai cities with only their great ward saving them. This situation also gave them their characteristic blue skin color. It would not be long before the Kheionai would found colonies across the sea, where many exiles, colonists, and excess population would be sent to. Known as Nekeis, most of them were still under the overlordship of their parent cities back in 1444, with only Amgremos and Ameion being completely independent. 3 major areas can be distinguished east of Alekand. The Devand is a wild, hilly and forested place, where the hostile Meteib Har and the nomadic Bashob Har make their homes. This is where the Kheionai colonists first landed outside their island. The Chendian steppe is a wild and flat stretch of dry grasslands populated by fierce and aggressive cat-riding Chendians. The region remains hopelessly divided between many warring tribes, but 3 of them rise above the rest: Keorg, Durasyar, and Sidarok, all sharing a dream of forming a united Chendian state. Taichend is a divided and warlike land filled with many different and populous ruin-born states. An empire had recently emerged from its northern hills. Larankar aims to subjugate all of Taichend, and the empire's subjects fuel its treasury with slaves, silks, and precursor artifacts from the greatest city in South Aelentir, Nankar. The oracle temples of Taichend spoke directly to their gods and often gave prophecies and warnings of the future. It was tradition for every Taichendi ruler to visit an oracle at least once during their reign. The Kheionai did not believe in gods, and neither did Laskaris. Yet the oracle's prophecies predicted his future just the same. He learned that death would find him at the age of 61. Until then, fate would provide an impenetrable shield against any vicissitudes that plague regular men. Laskaris himself was no regular man, but a hero of legend, and as such he led his Kheionai phalanx east, impaling the Taichendi cavalry in massive pikes and carving barbarian lands into a shining empire. In 10 years, the nation of Corimutren kneeled before Laskaris, and his hoplites humiliated the coastal warlords of Nagarviece, Stanan Ithvusam, Tirsin, and Gofira. Larankar to the north opted to rule through the submission of unruly vassal warlords, and in contrast, the Ameioni conquests in the south tended to be more direct, with all the advantages and disadvantages of ruling a numerous and foreign people. The city of Ameion itself and the islands surrounding the Taichend were being stretched thin to supply the logistics of the advancing army, so the Ameioni focuses had to be balanced between colonial expansion and military conquests. Diplomatically, while the respect of the Kheions was always appreciated, Ameion kept ties of friendship with the Nekeis of the eastern reaches of the Devant. These were Amgremos and Deyeion. The latter was a rebellious subject of the City of Soldiers, and soon pulled Laskaris' republic into a war of independence from their overlord. The Conqueror's Council of Ameion would oversee expansion into the Andic Reach. They were a group of talented individuals tasked to oversee the administration of the home provinces, while the Kilakas, or the ruler of the republic, was spending the vast majority of his time on the front lines. With this form of organization, Ameion overcame incredible odds, but Laskaris' disregard of the republic's nature had called its very foundation into question. Nevertheless, the nobility was supremely loyal to their hero, as were the disciplined hoplites. The Conqueror's Council was also extremely well prepared to face the challenges of establishing the core administrative apparatus in the conquered lands. The tribal Basobhar in the Andic Reach controlled plenty of fields ripe for farming, forests teeming with lumber, and hills waiting patiently for their ores to be uncovered. Colonists encroached inland, and the tribes were slowly uprooted, removed, or absorbed for the good of the Republic. The city needed a state just as much as the state needed a city. There was much development needed in the capital of Ameion itself to prove to its ancestors that it could be just as glorious as the Kheions in Alekand. In the east, Laskaris was busy regrouping the army and appropriately establishing legitimate claims on the broken Taichendi warlords. Many here deemed him to be an invader and a conqueror, but those in Corimutren saw him for what he was, a force of stability seeking to bring peace. It was they alone who knelt before Laskaris, and they alone who have shared in the rewards. Their city saw prosperity in the last decade, and they were ready to learn the principles of civilization, so that they could benefit from the victories that would follow. The spring of 1448 saw the phalanx marching again, and the renewed invasion continued to push Ameion's borders further east. Between battles, Laskaris the Conqueror mused further about his fate. He noted into his diary, "As I spend more time amongst the locals of Taichend, I learn more of their folklore. Their so-called gods are figures not too different than myself. Those scant few with the martial prowess to command authority over a large portion of Taichend. However, they claim their gods hold sway over destiny, while destiny in turn holds sway over mortals. As I learned my fate from one of their seers, it may be possible some among them hold the secret to avoiding my planned demise. The thought weighed on me for some time, but I ultimately decided my destiny is to lead Ameion." Trying to overcome this destiny was foolish and would distract him from his duty to his descendants and to his people. The warlords were trampled one by one. The siege of Gofira proved to be the more challenging one during the initial campaign. Laskaris inspected the defenses after the conquest of the fort, while his men marched to establish order. He was able to conclude that his methods of siege warfare could use some improvement, but a solid foothold in Taichend has been already established by the year 1451. Even if neighboring the Empire of Larankar, Ameion could not be pushed out in one fell swoop. The Kheionai were here to stay. The fruit of their labor began to manifest already in Corimutren. There, their elite gathered in their capital, eager to adopt the ways of the civilized world. Even if not blue in color, the people of the Korimutreni state of Clerectoram began resembling the Kheionai more and more. They started to speak the same language and viewed politics through the same lens. They named themselves as the Clerian and were greeted with applause in their new cultural family. In the meantime, the phalanx were brutally pacifying any resistance of the barbarian Taichendi that would rise up in arms occasionally against their heartless persecution within the Republic's borders. These practices of merciless discrimination and persecution were only the first of many to come in southern Aelentir. On the diplomatic front, with the city of Ameion growing in significance, and with Daeon breaking free after a long and lazy war of independence, the Conqueror's Council proposed the establishment of a three-way alliance between the three independent Nekes of the Andaic Reach. To the detriment of the Kheons, the resources extracted in the yet untapped expanse of land would be shared between the three states, and the exploited lands would be partitioned fairly between them, not allowing for petty disputes to fracture them as it did their forebearers in Alekand. The Eshate League would stand together from now on in the face of adversity, and together they would be a beacon of civilization in the brutal wilderness of the continent. For the regular people of Ameion, this was a good omen, a small feeling of safety for those who forgot the meaning of the word. On the front lines, Laskaris was laying down plans for the next push. His march across the Taichend was not the chaotic barbarity that the locals were accustomed to. Instead, it was a planned course, learning of the local defenses and military capabilities of the enemy before engagements. The Taichendi may have had strength in numbers, but the Kheionai had strength in capability. As the state borders expanded into the Devand, diplomatic capability was also required to tame the mountain marksmen that called the Mteibas Valley their home. The Mteibas Valley lied deep in the heart of the continent. This would be a perfect staging area for retreat and control of potential trade routes between the rich Taichend and the splendid domed cities of Alekand. The Mteibhar religious beliefs were animistic in nature, but also based on following the example of their legendary leader Munakles, who rose up in defiance and freed their ancestors, guiding them to the valley they currently inhabited. The Mteibhar believed this valley to be a sacred place and spent their history protecting it. The tribes came together periodically for remembrance gatherings where the elders recounted the deeds and virtues of Munakles. Ameion's delegation to the valley took the opportunity to attend one of such gatherings. They would use their banner of peace to conduct diplomacy with the barbarians' leadership and lay the groundwork for their education and incorporation under Ameion. Of course, the council did not expect voluntary submission, but knowing and respecting their silly little customs would relieve any tensions that eventual subjugation will cause. Laskaris himself took part in the delegation and wrote, "I met with the chief Bakerene I in his domain in Mazhara in an attempt to show them the benefits of Ameioni rule, but learned of their traditions of independence and past rebellion against slavery. I have deducted the key to incorporating them is to treat them as equals and show that they have nothing to fear from us. While these tribals may prove a thorn in the side of the Nekes, Mteibhara may prove to be a respectable civilization under our guidance, even if they must be unfortunately convinced by force. They may soon hate us, but their children will celebrate us." That delegation got exactly what they needed, and after they retreated to the capital, they were replaced by the Laskari phalanx. The poor tribal arrows would bounce off the massive shields of the Kheionai as they smashed into the valley with the force of civilization. In that particular year, 1460, Laskaris' fate was fulfilled. How exactly he passed was unknown. He kept the destined means of his demise a secret for almost 3 decades. He was found slumped over a tree stump with a smile upon his lips, as if content with all that he has accomplished with the time afforded to him. He was buried per his request, alongside the soldiers who died fulfilling his destiny, almost in eyesight of where his forces first landed in Taichend. His grave was adorned by those in mourning, but in time would resemble all those around it. So passed the Conqueror, who put Ameion on the map, while the Devandi cries for freedom were drowned out by the clanging of armor-clad hoplites. In a cruel twist of irony, Laskaris' successor ended up having the same name as the heroic ancestor of the Mteibhar, Munakles Melisurgos. On the other hand, where Laskaris recruited the nobility and troops loyal to them by promising land and influence at the expense of the locals, the new Munakles declared himself a servant of the Republic. With Laskaris gone, the loyalty of the nobles was not guaranteed anymore, and the people would have to be heard for the betterment of the realm. Following in the footsteps of the Conqueror was an intimidating task. Larankar would fall, but Munakles tried to prove himself first by approaching the cat riders of the northern plains. In contrast to their mountain cousins, the Chindians took a proactive approach in preserving their freedom. They believed that the only way to protect theirs was to take it from others until others stopped being a threat. Leaving the safety of the valley, they came across and bonded with a great many large felines, mountain lions, cheetahs, and jaguars. The Chindians rode and hunted together with their beasts. Munakles decided that Ameion must understand these practices and show the savages the consequences of their hostility in order to pacify them. As such, he ventured north with the intention of learning their customs and gauging interest in benefiting from Ameioni rule. He received his answer at the tip of a spear, with him and most of his entourage slaughtered and mauled by their felines. Laskaris was dead, and with him, the age of uncontested victory was over. The Chindians made this point abundantly clear. On the long run, though, the disunited tribes were no match for the well-trained Ameioni armies and were swiftly subjugated. Laskaris' legacy demanded the continuation of the campaigns in Taichend, and the Devandi were merely a distraction. In the later half of the 15th century, Larankar's empire was enormous in size, but fragile in its disunity. Rebellious warlord subjects would only care to secure their own little estates, paying simply lip service to their masters in the Laranka highlands. Their only real ally was the independent coastal state of Wultenwach. The open expanses of the Chindia plains were going to prove to be a dangerous vulnerability for Ameion's campaigns. The Laranka horsemen were adept in traversing great stretches of empty grasslands very quickly, despite the constant raids of the Chindian cat riders. The Taichendi fleets were also a respectable foe on the southern seas, yet quality won over quantity, and the vessels of Larankar crumbled one by one before the Ameioni formations. The Kheionai pushed ever closer to the city of Laskaris' desire. They did their best to differentiate themselves from the Laranka tyranny as they continued to bring their so-called peace to these lands. It was perhaps too late, but the Taichendi learned a different lesson in those wars. A lesson that for the perceived iron fist of their overlords, the Kimani silk gloves of the Ameioni were perhaps a greater and more terrible danger to their existence and livelihoods. Ameion's triumph was celebrated in the western homelands. They showed the Devandi the comforts of a well-tended field, bringing peace and civilization to their lands. They developed advanced military training routines together with their friends in the Eshate League, and they tamed the eastern barbarians, setting up a regional capital in Nagar Viece and funneling the riches of the subcontinent to the ever-glorious city of Ameion itself. The Kilakas of the West dreamed of a unified state. Those in Alecant sought to overthrow their peers and unite their island. The ancestors in Devand dreamed of uniting the Nekes into one front, free from the control of the homeland. Ameion was priming itself to build a completely new state, crossing the barrier between the different local squabbles and unite all of the known world under one identity. It would take time for such dreams to be made real. The Council of Conquerors felt it was time to bring representatives from Alekhand itself to prove to them that the Kheionai lifestyle was attainable even beyond the home islands, with enough focus and determination. Ameion proved to be a true Kheon past Alekhand, the first of its kind. With the southern subcontinent under control, colonization efforts could now be extended further east into the last uncivilized islands of the Taichent, with an ever-expanding horizon. The Ambennar people settled further into the Devant, while the Clerian identity spread by choice and by force through the rolling hills of the Taichent. A thicker and thicker line was being drawn between the Larankar unifiers and the Kheionai interlopers, both forces claiming to fight for peace, and both claiming to be the only ones who could truly provide it. The only difference being the ideological framework of this so-called peace. The vast majority of the conquered people have benefited from Ameioni rule according to reports. Yet there were many who were adamant about their desire to rule themselves. Regardless of evidence to the contrary, they insisted that they would be better off free. The recently subjugated Vultenvak had been more diplomatic and offered a proposition. If they received funding and if they would be assisted in their efforts to settle a large uninhabited island in the southern severed coast, then those discontented with Ameioni rule could choose exile to violence. While peculiar, having a place to put those with no hope of salvation from their destructive ways could prove beneficial to the majority who remained in the mainland. Timber Point would become the capital of the civilization of exiles, named as Liteibhar. The severed coast self-governing colony would become a home for the lost and the superstitious. Not even primal tribes wandered across this landmass. Here the exiles could build a place for their values, however backward, under the protection of the 8th Kheon. These exiles would have no allies to muster and would ultimately have to submit or come here. The Kalavendi subjects of Larankar saw the line drawn across the rolling hills and understood that the peace brought by the spears of the Blue Ruinborn gave the choice between submission of mind or exile. So they preferred the familiar tyranny to foreign liberty, setting themselves clearly on the northern side of the line. The southern side, the Taichendi stepped away from their destructive deities and began adopting the ways of the Kheons. Their farms were managed from centralized towns instead of whatever warlord recently killed the other. Irrigation had begun to allow their already mighty population to blossom, and the turmoil once in these lands was becoming a thing of the past. For Ameion, it seemed that even those defeated celebrated their victories. What confused the Conqueror's Council was this. Despite their previous defeats, the Empire of Larankar was looking stronger than ever before. Laskaris knew his destiny would create one for Ameion as a whole, one where this empire would be faced down and broken once and for all. Ameion would not fail the Conqueror. The next collision of destinies between the two empires would have to be final. In 1490, Ameion decided to drag the Taichendi screaming into a better life and free them from their oppressive tyrants, whether they wanted it or not. The enthusiasm of the defenders who chose to live in slavery under one of their own rather to live free under foreigners was baffling to the Kheionai. Even the colony in Liteibhar chose to support mainland liberty. When Ameion sent extremists from within their borders to live within their own autonomy, the intention was to let them live their own ways and leave the more worthy affairs to the Republic. However, it was not surprising that they held sympathies for their own people. The colony signed an illegal truce with Larankar and even threatened to turn tail and side with them in the hopes of returning to their barbaric ways. Another advantage of the Taichendi was knowledge of the terrain, letting them exploit weak points in the Ameioni fortifications while covering up their own. One way or another, they also learned from Laskaris, for tactics of the quality shown in this war were unthinkable before the arrival of the Blue Ruinborn. Insurgents sprang throughout the controlled subcontinent, and what was once apparently an easy prospect for victory turned into a grueling guerrilla war where enemies would spring out of the ground at every corner, punishing the hoplites and demolishing their formations. The most brutal conflict in the known history of the Kheionai to that point lasted for close to a decade, with fronts shifting back and forth across the land of Andeos. The calm beaches of the Thekvristana, rolling hills of the Jothanpir, the roaring Kalavend, the hidden highlands of the Larankar, all strewn with bodies and stained with blood. The Taichendi, a people eager for conflict, had the last fight taken from them. The mightiest of their tribes, Larankar, stood broken despite the aid of their kin. Ameion came here to bring peace, and with this magnificent war, their promise approached its precipice. Only the meek remained. The Larankar capital Urvant had fallen, and its leadership brought to Kilakas Ardorianus Paraspondylos to discuss the fate of Taichend. Emperor Amaravor Adrajiv I expected torture, either for himself or for his family members, to force his compliance. Instead, he was sat down and offered a variety of teas together with a map. On this map lied the borders of the remaining Taichendi states and where they fell in relationship to Ameion. Some would be made to kneel immediately, but for many this peace would be a beneficial one in the short term. Importantly, it removed any semblance of unity across the land, an opening to be filled by Ameion. The Amaravor knew they had no room to negotiate anything for their benefit, so in due time he was sent home to deliver the news to his allies and subjects. Not only that they were defeated, they were shown that the Kheionai ways were superior. The following truce allowed the armies to rest and for the administration to rebuild the devastated countryside. The leadership changed focus to diplomatic and administrative affairs in the Devand. Here the tribal subjects were elevated to nations. Settled and properly funded, the Devandi Ruinborn developed colonies of their own into the plains and valleys around them. Their people could eventually come to laugh at the ways of their ancestors and thank Ameion for showing them how to live peacefully under a common flag. The process was easier for the Matei Harans than for their mounted kin, but all would be educated eventually. Liteibhar also enjoyed relative peace. Ameion hoped that under their authority, the exiles' culture would perhaps someday flourish into something other than a wasteland. The Echate League settled along common borders, fought with common tactics, and championed the same causes. The only thing that was left was a unification of their diplomatic efforts once and for all. Naturally, as the largest and most glorious members of the League, Ameion was best suited to lead the common effort. Under their guidance, the two compatriots would share in their glory. Thus, in 1505, Amgremos and Deieon submitted as vassals to their eastern partner. Two lighthouses of civility in an ocean of savagery, maintained by a capable and worthy keeper. The religion of the Alekandi Ruinborn was more appropriately called a philosophy. The Kheionai were uniquely atheistic, not believing in the existence of any deities whatsoever. Instead, they placed their faith in their elected leaders to lead them into the future. The core tenets of Kheionism revolved around the power of city-states as the base of all civilization, and of hero worship to some extent. Alongside a tendency to have increased trade efficiency and republican tradition, many governmental philosophies existed in Kheionism. But three most prominent were the Meideritic rule, the Dictats of Iscaropeus, and the Axierophonic mandate. Kheionist states followed the governmental philosophy of its head of state. Traditionally, the next head of state would follow a different government philosophy than their predecessor, and two heads of state in a row following the same philosophy was quite an uncommon occurrence in Kheionist states. Mederites of Kimanis was best known for his great treatise on government. Tides, a series of dialogues on the ebb and flow of the fortunes of elves and their Kheons. Mederites argued that every government had strengths and weaknesses that exposed themselves in times of acute stress. Of the many forms of government, those that fail to adapt always fail, while those that can grow will minimize stressors on their society and hold the best chance to thrive. As such, Mederitic governmental policy seeks to prevent the entrenchment of static forces that will stop a state from evolving as needed, and emphasize the importance of destroying special interest groups that would steer a government away from being able to act decisively to its people. Isparokeos of Empkeos believed that reality was tethered not to physical things but to the perception of those things within the minds of each elf. As such, it was not the measurable strength of a Kheon that mattered, but the perception of said Kheon's strengths and prestige. For if all believe a Kheon to be honorable, mighty, and just, then such a thing becomes true. Isparokean philosophy thus stressed the need to constantly cultivate a potent reputation internally and externally, securing the Kheon with aggrandizing words carried on swift ships and silver tongues. Axierophon of Lokemeion's teachings noted that the foremost role of a Kheon's government is to serve the people, and that a people are best served by being made secure. Security was necessary for a people's rights to be guaranteed, and security from threats internal and external could only be maintained with a strong military and a monopoly on force that could be deployed to crush internal rebellions and dissuade foreign enemies from attacks. Sometimes derided as a philosophy of might makes right, Axierophonic governmental policy placed military affairs at the front and center of the Kheon's decision-making in order to protect its people. Each philosophy grants a different set of bonuses related to their area of interest, depending on the amount of crown land the state controls. These range from 20% respective advisor cost reduction on the lower end, through 10% cheaper respective technology cost, and finally a +1 free respective policy bonus on the higher end of controlled crown land amount. Ameion found itself in the unique position to eventually promote a fourth major philosophy. In Ameion's later form, instead of electing an individual to rule, they argued that Kelindas Laskaris' entire bloodline was elected to be the leaders of the Kheon in the days of their progenitor, and that they continued to carry the mandate of election. If the Laskaris dynasty would end, then there would be no telling how these assertions would be tested. The cult of Laskaris would mainly give bonuses to absolutism and yearly absolutism gain. With the threat of Larankar gone, the Ameioni state could take its time to subjugate the lands of the disparate warlords remaining in the east. Disunited, they stood little chance. The only obstacle to total domination were the restrictions of the civilized conquest, administration and integration of the acquired territories. The encroachment of Kheionai culture and civilization sparked a wave of curiosity about the unknown past from before the day of Ashen Skies, and an interest in the secrets of the Precursor Empire. Several sites, some forgotten, some abandoned, would gradually resurface, and the state, together with the mage estate, would begin to slowly invest in archaeological exploration of the discovered Precursor ruin sites. The first excavation took place in Ratheion, just a few provinces away from the capital city. The excavation there uncovered something very simple: a statue of an elf sitting, seemingly watching the nearby flow of the river. What was exciting about this was the extraordinary skill that has gone into the work, such that even after centuries covered in dirt, it still seemed as though it could come to life and walk away from the water. After meticulous cleaning, it was uncovered that the statues were unpainted, and the colorings of the stones were either carefully selected or possibly even altered by magic to match the intended image. While the pale skin coloration did not match their own, the blue Ruinborn asked themselves, are the blue sky and white clouds not both part of the same wondrous sky? From one seed, a cultural legacy was about to grow again, to the joy of the mages and thinkers across the realm. In the middle of the 16th century, a major historical event occurred in South Aelentir. For a millennium and a half, the Kheons charted and understood the world around them. But this knowledge was shockingly expanded by a fleet of nothing short of elves landing on the shores of the shattered coast. Flying a banner portraying a phoenix bird covering the sun, they called themselves the Exemplars of Jahir. Excitement gripped the Kheon Diplomats and scholars rushed east to find out more about these elves and the larger world they came from. The elves, though, did not reciprocate the excitement. They simply asked to speak with the leader and inquired coldly about Precursor relic sites. They also demanded submission to none other than the sun, claiming that Surael was the one true god, which astounded the Kheionai philosophers. Surely these elves were not plagued with superstition. Alas, despite the Jaharians' technology and skills, they knew nothing of the Precursors and had no respect for the local philosophies. A conflict erupted almost immediately. A looming dread gripped the population. The larger world was alive, but misguided. And these were not going to be the last interlopers to come demanding riches and supplication. 1522 saw an unusual success for Ameion. Laskaris' dream of fully conquering the great city of Nankar was finally complete. The Kalavendi vassals were entrusted the honor of administering and restoring it before it would be handed over to the Republic, but its coffers were fully under Ameion's jurisdiction. The Conqueror's Republic had become a patchwork of peoples from the steppes of the Chendia to the hills of Taichent, with a glorious Kheon at the heart of it all. Trade routes that were once perilous were now commonly traversed, and while the language of the Kheons was becoming gradually adopted across the board, the cultures that existed at the peripheries were still distinct. In the spirit of the principle of the city-state, the Kilakas of Ameion's duty was to bring the people into one identity. Therefore, he called a summit, representative of the various ways of life. They were to meet in the capital and attempt to weave the separate threads into a common quilt. Swift and fierce in battle, the Chendians were the first delegation to arrive at the summit. They were wearing pelts crudely refashioned into diplomatic wear, bringing gifts of tobacco and gold jewelry. They valued freedom more than anything, and even now they would rather fight to the last than becoming second-hand citizens. They left with a promise of tax breaks, which the council hoped to ease their rebellious spirits until they would fully understand the ways of the Kheon. The representatives of Deyeon and Amgremos were scarcely distinguishable from their hosts. They exchanged fabrics and food suitable for voyages or winter shortages. The friends in the Echate League had the fewest complaints, but took the opportunity to call attention to the waterways through the seas of Ameion connecting the Devant to Taichent. They requested more attention to the port facilities that took a back seat to the land routes in the previous years, and they left with funds to build new shipyards on their coasts. The humble Mateich Bar were next. Their woolen clothes were less than impressive, but it was clear that they had made genuine effort to imitate the Ameioni outfits. As a gesture of goodwill, they brought incense and small stone statues, the former mistaken as spices by the Taichendi, while the latter suspected to be too heavy to be carried home by Chendians without wheel or ship. In an attempt to further learn the Kheionai ways, they sought out help in centralizing the assorted mountain tribes. The Ameion Council decided to send help to codify common law for the people of the mountain passes. From Taichent, the Tekvristana and Yothanpir came decorated in the extravagant style of their upper caste, with a handful of Cleriens in a peculiar style that took aspects of both of their heritages. They brought spices and teas which many in the West would go out of their way to acquire. They also brought elegant taffeta cloths. Their argument was that for the commoners to know the benefits of Ameioni rule, then the Republic should invest more effort and resources to develop and build their lands. The council chose to grant additional funding for academies and public works, making the delegation quite pleased. At the conclusion of the summit, after 2 months of fraternizing, the representatives returned to their homelands laden with goods from their counterparts. The city's alcohol reserves may have been empty, but groups that considered themselves alien and hostile would remember those days of diplomacy and nights of revelry. Some were even eager to learn the common language to foster communication between newfound friends. For Ameion, the time to work was just starting. Promises were made and needed to be fulfilled, and in the process many superstitions had to be dispelled by the power of philosophy and reason. A time of peace, stability, and exploration followed. The people in the steppes, though happy with their simple ways of life, were not allowed to stagnate in their comfort. The Taichendi were coerced to see the value of peaceful coexistence, and the Kheionai ships were making sure that all the coasts were well supplied with any exotic good that they could dream of. Conquistadors, following the discovery of peoples from across the oceans, began to explore the continent that was so tragically lost and forgotten a millennium and a half ago. The people of South Aelentir slowly grew to understand that even between different shades of skin, they were all born from the ruins of the so-called Precursors, and who they were in the 16th century stemmed from how their ancestors responded to this legacy. Tradition, civilization, freedom, and progress were becoming interwoven. A multitude of regional capitals grew across the continent, and the Parliament of the People was installed in the Conqueror's Republic to listen to everyone's needs on their journey of education and beyond. A keen mind would spot some shades of dishonesty in the Republic's posturing about unity, brotherhood, freedom, and peace. While the decade of peace following the summit was seen as a positive sign for the future, it was immediately followed by further conquests in the Larankar highlands. More war, more strife, more grief. The discontents were still silenced and/or sent to Litei Bhar, as the law dictated. Vassal tribes and states lost more and more of their autonomy, despite the promises of liberty. Encroachment from Cannorian outlanders into the Lai Peninsula and the coastal islands was just the right opportunity for the council to push further the notion that only in unity will freedom be truly achieved. The Eshate nations already considered themselves as one altogether. They also saw merit in uniting with the remaining Nekeis that loitered under the shadow of Alekand. If coerced into unity, they could work together to bring peace to all the Kheionai. These new ambitions were on par with Laskaris' dreams of a blue empire. And as an omen of victory, a familiar name rose through the ranks of the phalanx during the continuation wars in Taichend. Kelindas Laskaris, a descendant of Laskaris the Conqueror, proved comparable in skill to his ancestor. General Kelindas rode together with his companions across the north and sailed as far as the Leech Dens to fight beasts and men for the glory of the Kheon. In Alekand, Ormam, the city of traders, overcame the other Kheons and was proving to be the main competitor against the 8th Kheon of the east. Ameion found itself between a rock and a hard place, once again surrounded by ambitious foes. In 1574, Kilakas Ivranes Paraspondylos decreed a total ban on trade with the nations not native to Aelentir. This was done to prevent Cannorians from influencing the nation to ruin and collapse. The outsiders were feared to be usurpers and slavers, so their tolerance was proof of maliciousness if not treason. The complete embargo gave the council some space to concentrate on the eastern unification of the Devandi Kheionai and the liberation of the old Kheons from Ormam's oligarchy. The council itself prepared to move its apparatus of institutions to the city of Nankar, as Laskaris the Conqueror had dreamed. The Nakarians had to be taught how to think as the Kheionai, and becoming clerien in a city this large was both attainable and difficult. Multitude of peoples and creeds huddled together had to be educated one way or another, but together they would benefit from the exploits of the phalanx at the edges of the ever-expanding Great Republic. Renamed as Nakyra, the crown jewel of the Taichend, the city would see splendor again. Ameion's administration made it its home in 1588 and appointed General Kelindas Laskaris as its mayor. A splendid prize for a splendid leader of men. Of course, under non-civilized rule, this would have been unattainable. But through civilization and through the expulsion of Ebortili humans from the southern isles, the discontented Taichendi would find more than enough room on Ameioni's Isle of Severance. Many would have argued that no city not built by the Kheionai could earn the title of Kheon, Kelindas' ambitions were to achieve it. Under his guidance, it would become clear that the Precursors who built the domed cities in Alekhand were the one and same as those who laid the foundations of Nakyra. Even more than the city of Ameion, Nakyra would stand as a testament to the might of both the Kheionai and of those who came before them. Kelindas Laskaris sponsored an archaeological expedition within the past of the city, which discovered that, under the shoddy Taichendi infrastructure, lied sublime architecture undoubtedly built by the ancient predecessors. Under the district of Nakyra Eripidemis, ruins that seemed to carry the means to store and load an incredible amount of goods and supplies were unveiled. Research revealed that this facility was some sort of warehouse on the route to another mysterious city called Tachenie. Research and speculation assumed that the logistics involved to transport goods from the uncovered ruins to Tachenie were impractical outside of a short distance. This meant that unless the presence of another nearby city was completely missed, then Tachenie was indeed a city capable of movement. Calavent's waters were not wide enough for an ark ship, and the ground was too stagnant. The only remaining explanation was that the city once flew through the skies, likely returning occasionally to resupply. The remaining question was, where did Tachenie go when the skies turned to ash? While Nakyra was educated and reconstructed, the council was receiving rumors of discontent from the mouth of the Calavent River. At the southern gateway of Taichend, in the walled city of Nakar Koraim, groups of Ruinborn still loyal to their Oren Koraim traditions were conspiring to evade Ameioni rule and their so-called abusive restriction on trade with the Cannorians. The Cannorians were of course going to profit from this discontent and propped up the Oren Koraim dreams of so-called independence. The traitors proudly called themselves the last free port of Taichend, and this state of affairs had to be stopped. The army who marched in to silence the dissenting voices was surprised to find layers of fortifications in their path. The Oren Koraim were few in number, but their dream was to resist until armies from their allies in Cannor would arrive to aid them. It seemed like all of Cannor rallied to the aid of the rebels. In turn, Moonhaven, Bjarnrik, Busilar, Pearl's Edge, Riveria, Grombar, Vern, and Neckliffe all sent gifts of money and manpower, pikes and guns to aid the surrounded freedom fighters. The Ameioni fleet was humiliated at sea, so it changed its doctrine from heavy ship dominance to outmaneuver its rivals, evading blockades and allowing it to land hoplites on the surrounding islands and take forts that supplied the rebels on the Calavent. After a grueling and brutal guerrilla war, the rebels were eventually crushed and their resistance pushed into the ocean, to sink and be forgotten. South Aelentir would stay closed to the outside world forever. After the western ports have been pacified, the phalanx turned east once more, crushing Ormam on the battlefield again and again. The fleet, reconstructed, patrolled the eastern islands between the Devand and Alekhand, overseeing the clash between civilizations. The Nekeis, founded centuries ago by the Kheons, have never known self-rule. They have served as merely colonies, existing to take in those who could not fit within the warded walls. Ameion may have come as conquerors, but they saw these people as kin, and promised them true autonomy under the wing of the Conqueror's Republic. Apikoksi, Mesolaki, Eneion, Keolion, and Emkeos were set up as Glykeons, subjects in name, but free to pursue their own agendas within predefined borders decided by the council from Nakyra. Unique amongst the Nekeis, Anisikeon was founded entirely in the islands within the cleaved sea. Their admiralty was set up as a Glykeon as well, but their authority over the Sound Toll was relinquished by their new overlords. Only Alekhand itself remained. It was ready to be split open and liberated just as well. The preparations for its invasion was interrupted by yet another wind of discord that blew over Ameion. In his arrogance, Kelindas Laskaris, the would-be inheritor of Laskaris the Conqueror's legacy, has taken to holding military parades in his city. While such events were not unheard of, Nakyra was the capital of Ameion. It was ruled by the Lord Mayor, yet it did not belong to him, so the council attempted to put a stop to the gatherings before his influence would spiral out of control. On the political scene, Kelindas has overseen the transformation of the city from a war-torn heap into a Kheon surpassing any other. This bolstered his standing not only with the local Cannorian people, but also with the residents of the countryside. His most recent tax standardization reforms provided him with even more leverage and popularity. This made the council more and more concerned. Eventually, Nakyra erupted with political fervor. Either for or against him, people would ponder Kelindas' political actions. A good number of people had even taken to the streets, distributing pamphlets encouraging their fellow citizen to provide Kelindas with further powers and support. The council panicked and called for his arrest. But that would only risk turning a local hero into a martyr. Merely weeks after his imprisonment, his supporters had laid siege to the prison and allowed him to walk free, in open defiance of the rule of law and of civilization. Armed resistance was now real. Civil war imminent. Many had watched Kelindas Laskaris' rise to power with concern, but just as many did so with enthusiasm. The Cannorian adopted Kheionai customs, but their faith in the Republic was not at all settled. They ended up believing that authority should come from one man, and that man was Kelindas. He took up the mantle with pride and vowed to reforge Ameion into an empire never seen before by the Kheionai. Behind this powerful message, the 9th Kheon, the Empire of Nakyra, declared open war against the corrupt Republic of Ameion, and in 1612, the winds of discord, the Lite Dano, began in earnest. This war was unlike any other before in the history of the Kheionai. Here, the best armies in the known world were facing their own. Battles would be fierce, and only complete and total victory would end the strife. Liteibhar, the island of exiles, declared its allegiance for Nakyra, which was a clear advantage for Kelindas. Their exile fleets would raid the Republic's shores and disrupt their supply lines. Both sides braced for impact and mustered their split forces into a cohesive line. Rebels caught on both sides of the conflict did their best to disrupt their apparent enemies, making the mustering of forces even more difficult. Not long into the open conflict, the Chindians declared independence from the Republic. This looked like another victory and an inevitable advantage for the rebel emperor. Sereg was more than obviously an enemy of Ameion, yet Kelindas could not relinquish the rightful lands of the Cannorian. As a continuator of Laskaris, his rule over the Devandi could not be contested. A civil war transformed into a three-way war for domination over South Aelentir, and the cat-riding barbarians were not going to be easy prey. The exiled Taichendi rarely exhibited true loyalty to the mainland government. This was a fact of life, accepted as long as they paid their taxes and existed quietly on their island. Liteibhar's argument when they withdrew from the conflict was that as there was no external force for them to be called against, they had no intention to involve themselves in what was clearly an internal affair. Enraged, Kelindas could do nothing but accept their white peace signed with Ameion. They may not have been loyal, but they were indeed not traitors either. Not in a technical sense, at least. The Gili Kheon, though, did accept the call of the Republic. This would make things more complicated for Emperor Laskaris, but that was a risk he calculated for. To make things even worse, despite the philosophical education of the Taichendi and the undoing of their pagan faith, the potential divinity of Kelindas was lingering in the thoughts of many. Such rumors did spread centuries before regarding the original Laskaris, but after his death, they persisted only in niche circles. Kelindas' constructions within Nakyra had earned him not only the loyalty of the locals, but the worship as well. He was forced to return from the front to the capital to settle this issue and declare to an audience of both Cannorian and loyal Taichendi that he was their king, but not their god. His attempts to settle the matter resulted in a revolt-sized brawl in the city, where believers fought unbelievers for days until the phalanx stepped in to restore order. Nakyra would be a bastion of reason and honest thought. Superstitions had no place in the lands of the Empire. Sandwiched between Emperor Laskaris and the Republic, Chendian revolt stood little chance. Their raiding tactics proved ineffective against a disciplined and well-prepared army. After their fall, the Republic of Ameion was surrounded by the Nakyran legions, and the former Nekeis were exposed. It was just a matter of time until they would be systematically and completely defeated and liberated from their former liberator. In 1621, the Empire was finally made whole again. Ameion took the guise of a republic, but if they knew of the deceit or if they expertly deceived themselves was a debate for weekend philosophers in tea houses. In their hubris, the Ameioni forgot that their successes were the result of Laskaris' work, the result of his sweat and blood. It was only natural that his children were the only ones capable to hold the realm together. The Litei Dano had ended. The bleeding wound was closed. What was left was to let the scars of this nation heal under the enlightened rule of the Laskaris dynasty. The internal grand Kheionization project continued as before, and so did the search for the past secrets of the Precursors. Down the river Kalavend, a few days away from Nakyra itself, explorers discovered something interesting yet again. There was evidence of great destruction in all inhabited places, but in Katapfige, some of it seemed to be deliberate. Pillars broken cleanly rather than abruptly, scorch marks evenly separated along a wall, and the grounds were littered with makeshift wands and staves of quality comparable to 17th century Kheionai ones, but clearly cheap by Precursor standards. The nature of the destruction was confusing, until explorers found the canvases enchanted with illusory magic to depict an elf going through the motions of spell casting, with others seeming to perform some sort of yoga. Nakyran mages were able to feel their own magic well up and flow when they mimicked the tapestries. But much more pertinently, every non-mage seemed to have discovered an untapped well of magic within themselves by means of these exercises. Results of this dig have proven spectacular when attempted away from these training grounds, but allowing potential mages access to this place did substantially increase the presence of mages in Nakyran society, especially within the ruling classes. Precursor civilization may have been gone, but their blood was living on through the Ruinborn. There was no better chance to harness the magical powers than in the final set of wars with the last of the Kheons. The Kheons, the epicenter of their world, had stood for over a millennium, and quite possibly well beyond that. Old and stale, it was time for the island of Alekand to submit to the only true nation-state of the Kheionai. Their domed city remained locked in a past that they could barely remember or understand. Their people had to accept that it was time for the old Kheons to retire. Peace would eventually come to the death-wind-plagued islands where only Ormam, the city of trade, remained defiant in its arrogance. During the wars in Alekand, a Nakyiran dig site was installed in the city of soldiers, Degakeion. It had always been the most militaristic of the Kheons, but how exactly this came to be was never clear. Deep chambers underneath Degakeion held the answer. The Kheons' wards against the Kaidano were made to keep the entire area safe from external threats, but comparable devices found alongside prison cells indicated that they were also made to keep threats of similar magnitude within them. Also, records indicated that these wards were built well after the Kheons themselves, implying a relatively sudden need to contain such magical strength. Amongst the subterranean chambers was a library containing knowledge of military doctrine of the applications of magic in warfare, likely intended to serve as something for the inhabitants of the prison to entertain themselves with. It was safe to assume that these instruments were made to contain precursor mage generals in a great civil war. More curiously, the few books not concerning war magic seem to detail the politics of the Ascendant One these generals served, who alone could oppose the false gods the Precursors believed in. The Kheionai lack of theology seemed normal to everyone at the time, but this, being a deliberate effort of their ancestors, was a fascinating discovery. They didn't need gods to govern the world. The people have rebuilt civilization without their interference. Around the Ameion Sea, governments had legitimacy, not gods. The wars with Ormam resulted in the rebirth of the old city-states. Like a council of retired elders, the historical Kheons were allowed to exist as autonomous structures under the protective cowl of the Nakyrans, just like the Devandi Nekeis. Each of the 7 received a portion of the western part of the island. On the eastern side, the Eltikani were also granted their grazing lands back. Not as sophisticated as their western neighbors, the simple Eltikani were kin, so they deserved a state of their own as fellow Kheionai. The amazing discoveries in Alicant, together with the other historical discoveries throughout the last decades, allowed Nakyran scholars to embark on the final quest to discover the location of the lost city of Tachenia. The search began in the Thousand Peaks, or Veyi Sikarha. These were the mountains that shielded most of Taichent from the worst of Aelentir's calamity. While they didn't protect Tachenia from this, the numerous valleys between the mountains held many unexplored pockets which could hold its ruins. Mages were employed to scry the hard-to-reach places, and the search started in 1645. 2 years later, the search extended into the jungles of Larankar, a rough and untamed territory which could easily hide secrets. The Adventurers Guild sent its best men to tame the wilds and look for any signs that they could find. Even more years later, search was extended into the Kalavend, which was always a hotbed of precursor discoveries. Teams of artificers were sent to sort and determine whether relics were regular or could potentially have come from the great city. A total of 10 years of searching returned nothing significant. In 1655, the search for the city became more of a bizarre hobby than a real hope, but the Empire kept funding more and more searching parties. The final plan was to try and delve into the cursed Blue Desert. The Kaidano, or Death Winds, were the bane of the Kheionai. They held credit for driving their people from Alicant to bring civilization to the rest of Aelentir. It was very possible that Tachenia's magic was responsible for corrupting the sands into the lethal force they knew them to be. To determine this, however, it was necessary to venture into this extreme landscape. Mages were employed to protect the explorers as well as they could from the deadly sands, and the search in the Kaidano commenced. One of the expedition leaders wrote in their journal, 1658 years ago, the skies from which we rule this world were cast to shadow. While the warmth of the sun would return, the civilization Elvenkind built remained in darkness. It was within this umbra Tachenia awaited us, and we found her perched between 2 hills already explored and known to be hiding no such secrets. Several were convinced it was a mirage, for on first sighting it seemed to be untouched, as though we had wandered into the past to the world of our ancestors. As we approached, however, the lucid dream returned to reality, as we were met with great stones and rotted wood. A hollow wind took to the air as we surveyed our surroundings, unaccompanied until a singular bird emerged and began to sing. Turn your head left and you will see a tower still standing and glinting in the sunlight. Turn it right and see a similar tower decayed to rubble. It is clear that Tachenia did not survive the ruin in one piece, but she was not obliterated in the same manner as the rest of her civilization. As far as one can tell, the city has slept here unperturbed since she landed. Scant records indicating her surviving inhabitants abandoned her for Eresel, where supplies could be found. Even as they left her in peace, using what could have been the last of their great magics to conceal her so that she may remain in grandeur when they return. So too did they leave their dead, gently but swiftly laying their departed so they may rest alongside their city. The chaos invoked by the ruin would not see them return to the city, but after many years we have come in their stead. She may never again be spotted in the cerulean skies, but what remains of her buoyant architecture will see us raise our own civilization to new heights. Dear Tachenie slept no longer. When the Kheionai set out from their domed cities to settle the Devand, it was known even then that their objective was to restore civilization to the mainland. What was not known at the time was just how massive an undertaking this would be. As the old Kheons began to fight amongst themselves, a higher purpose was lost to their people. It was Laskaris the Conqueror who called Ameion back to this duty, and he set the stage for his nation to bring order and prosperity to both Taichent and the Devand and ensure peace in Alekhand itself. After centuries of turmoil, Nakyra stood as a nation the Ruinborn could take pride in. One that stood on the shoulders of the Precursors proudly, knowing that every victory brought them closer to their glory. In the 18th century, much of Aelentir stood occupied by the humans of Cannorian, elves, which claimed a legacy they willingly abandoned. But so long as Nakyra stood, the truth would remain that it was them who rightfully inherited these lands. Aelentir was a land known for its chaos. Its modern history was defined by its apocalyptic destruction over 1,000 years ago. For most of the time since then, the lands they now encompassed never settled away from this chaos. Raiders and warlords dominated the region. The Kheons were bombarded by the Kaidano. Even the city of Ameion was once humble, a riverside patch of dirt settled by the losing faction of a war. In more recent times, they took it upon themselves to end this chaos, to restore the peace their ancestors held for millennia. Those who found comfort in the disorder resisted them, afraid of the bright future they had in mind. But just as eyes adjust to daylight after time indoors, they found themselves living lives of comfort their grandparents could not comprehend. Even still, they were but one corner of Aelentir. The chaos had not been vanquished in the FLI to the north. The Kaidano still raged. Many of the elves reborn in the ruin found themselves subjugated by powers who had no right to these lands. Nakyra's victory stood regardless, for they had made themselves the bedrock of Aelentir, the foundation from which the Ruinborn would rebuild the legacy of their ancestors destroyed. Laskaris drew out the sword, but Nakyra now sheathed it. And there it is. Ameion is done. I've heard different opinions about this stag, and it's time I gave mine. I hate Ameion. I hate their arrogance, I hate their dishonesty under the guise of a civilizing mission, and I hate their hubris. I think they are evil, and thus their internal struggles make perfect sense to me. As a single-player enjoyer, I think that the different internal conflicts that this stag has over the centuries fit perfectly as a rightful punishment for their actions. I mean all of that as a compliment. The mechanical aspects of the nation took a backseat to their story and mission tree. While I can see where they can be frustrating in multiplayer, I have nothing but praise for their imaginative construction. In the choice between the continuation of the Republic and the switch to Kelindas' empire, the fact that I expanded aggressively to the west was the thing that tipped the scale. I could not be bothered to fight in the Leech Dens for 100% war score. A bit of a shame though, because Ameion's ideas and unique government are slightly better for conquest than Nakyra's. The final mission was also a bittersweet victory. Its requirements are that all the owned provinces are of the Kheionai Ruinborn culture. This means that conquest will prolong the efforts needed to achieve victory. The choice is between waiting in place until conversions are complete, relinquishing lands, or hoping that aggressive purging is fast enough to compensate for the amount of lands conquered. In the end, the reward is lackluster, maybe disappointing to some extent, but for me personally, as an enemy of Ameion, This feels like justice. These people deserve nothing better. I'm still eagerly awaiting for the Steam release of Sarhal and will refrain from recording in the Bitbucket, but I still have some ideas until its awaited release. Many thanks to the legion of passionate developers of the mod and to the lovely Patreons and members. So thank you Deppert, Nevermind Plays 2.0, Sam Hendricks, Generalissimo, Maybe Pigeon, Shredded Paper Plate, Alex, Thornsmain, and as always, thank you Baconomics. And thank everyone else too for your love and support. Cheers!